This conference will now be recorded.
Hey there, folks. Welcome to today's webinar, Conflict Resolution Through Effective Interpersonal Communication. My name is Kendall Jamal Doucette. I'm the Mental Health and Wellness Consultant with Wellness and Learn Initiatives under the Gardening Care Suite of Services. Welcome today. So before we begin, I would like to start with a territory acknowledgement. I would like to begin by acknowledging the Indigenous peoples of all the lands that we are on today. And while we meet today on a virtual platform, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge the importance of the lands which I call home. I'm situated on the land that is the traditional home of the Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, Mississauga, and Wendat Neonwensial peoples. I recognize and deeply appreciate their historic connection to this place. I also recognize the contributions Indigenous peoples have made in shaping and strengthening these communities. I'm grateful for the opportunity to meet here and ask that you join me in a moment of reflection to acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past and to consider how we are and can, each in our own way, try to move forward in a spirit of reconciliation, collaboration, to reaffirm our commitment and responsibility in improving relationships between nations, and to improving our own understanding of local Indigenous peoples and their cultures. Thank you. So some session objectives for today. Participants will be able to recognize how to manage our own consistent and calm behavior to positively impact conflict, learn strategies to strengthen both our verbal and nonverbal communication. We'll also understand our communication style and why we opt to utilize this style for our expressions. We'll also identify and understand how to be responsive to various levels of conflict, and also look at learning inclusive behavior practices to promote a sense of belonging and community wellness. So why is today's seminar important? Effective communication and conflict are not mutually exclusive nor new concepts across our human condition. And yet, still many of us find ourselves needing a deeper understanding of why these concepts must be integrated into our experiences, so that we can move forward with one another in a way that feels respectful of difference and with the intention of not othering, but rather including that difference and making space for it to be honored. In fact, when we are not able to effectively communicate what our needs are, how we would like them to get them met, the underpinnings of resentment or conflict can easily rise to the surface. So while this webinar has a focus on effective interpersonal communication and conflict resolution, it can also help to support a larger discussion on what happens when we feel we do not have the skills or the strategies to engage with, and also the impacts on our individual mental health and community well-being. So what is interpersonal communication exactly? So interpersonal communication is important as it allows us to identify, articulate, express our needs and how we are looking to have them met. And yet this is still a skill that not everyone engages with in a conscious way. Communication is vital to our self-actualization, so moving towards our strivings, our goals, what we want in our life, our self-expression, so who we are, what we have inside of us, and how we want to share that with the external world. And also, it's important in creating balance and harmony in our lives. And so, interpersonal communication can also be described as an exchange of information between two or more people. The difference here between interpersonal communication and other forms of communication, like mass communication, is the interactivity. So, it is a dialogue, it is the in between, right? Interpersonal communication is also relational. So that means that it's aimed towards building and sustaining our relationships. So it's really vital to the maintenance and sustaining of healthy relationships. An example also here uh, with communication, it is about the inter, so that's the between two or more, and there's also the intra, so that's going within that interpersonal communication. What is your inner dialogue? Do you understand what's happening inside of you? Having an awareness of what is going on inside of you is going to actually provide clarity when you do engage in interpersonal communication. When we don't know what is coming from inside of us or the other person, we might uh, we might be missing a lot of really key points in what is trying to be communicated. And I want to also name this. Sometimes it's easier to identify something that is anxiety provoking inside of us in somebody else, right? So get to understand what is that inner dialogue, what's that internal dialogue, and how has that impacted my ability to be in relationship with others and also practice my interpersonal communication in a way that feels effective, where things land, things are being communicated, and they're also heard and understood. So interpersonal communication, like I was just mentioning, is really important for us because it allows us to identify, articulate, and express our needs, our desires, our wants, how we can get them met, how we want to be in relationship with one another. It's also important in accomplishing our goals. So our work is ultimately about doing stuff, whether that's building a house or fixing a clunky interface from a website. It is about being in relationship as a collective and moving towards a collective goal or collective strivings. So that whether that is your team or you expand that out a little further, and that's the organization wide, it's important between for the maintenance and also for the goals. And like I was mentioning as well, it's also really important for our relationships. So strong relationships and are the engines of productive workplaces. And more importantly, our emotional well-being. So we need each other. It's very important. We need each other for support so that we can grow, so that we can learn. Relationships are built and sustained only through interpersonal communication. It's also really important on the leadership level. So effective leadership also involves the ability to motivate team members to work towards a common goal. To do so, leaders must possess the interpersonal communication skills needed to motivate their teams. It's also about listening. So it's not just about talking, right? It's a dialogue, right? It's not just about what you're thinking, what you're trying to express, but it's actually about what are they hearing, and then what are they reflecting back to me, and having an awareness of what that is. So interpersonal communication is not just about talking; it's also about listening, which is a key ingredient to problem solving and decision making. Without this tool, we're only having a conversation with ourselves. And that's also important for conflict resolution. So working with other people usually involves negotiating some form of conflict. And in order to resolve these conflicts, we need to first understand and have the ability to voice these concerns and also advocate for ourselves while sustaining strong relationships. So it's a really important tool to be able to effectively communicate what is going on for you when conflict arises, when there is no conflict. This is actually a way that we can manage conflict. It's like I understand what you're trying to communicate, I heard it, and vice versa, right? Creating that space. So what can impact our ability to effectively engage in interpersonal communication? Trauma. So trauma can impact the way in which we experience ourselves, also how we experience ourselves in relation to the external world. Trauma can act as a negative filter through which we see the world and those who inhabit it, and what we can expect in relationships. So we have to be mindful of what kind of trauma we might have experienced, or what are we bringing into the workplace. How are we being impacted by the workplace? What are our thoughts, behaviors, feelings? What's happening for us as we engage in our workplace? What is our body telling us, right? So having an understanding of what your triggers are, how you've been impacted, and what are the long lasting effects of that will be great for your ability to be effective in your communication. Culture also impacts the way that can be also be a barrier for us, rather. So culture impacts the way we communicate and and who we communicate with. Some cultures may be disrespectful to address an elder, to make eye contact, to directly connect with a certain gender when experiencing conflict and also when not experiencing conflict. And also how these customs play out is it can be culturally impacting. It can really challenge our ability to communicate effectively with one another. Power is also something that can impact us, our ability to communicate effectively. So, in some cultures where hierarchies exist, there can be a power imbalance. So, this could be the workplace. Often, individuals lower in this hierarchy can feel disempowered, silenced, or that they're lacking the right to speak up. That they can be empowered to have agency and advocate for themselves, and also let others know how they're being impacted. If there's a workplace in which there's a structural hierarchy and there's channels in which you have to go through just to connect with somebody, that can actually really impact our ability to have effective interpersonal communication. So, what are some things that we can do to work with engaging in effective interpersonal communication? So, it's important that we know our priorities. What are we trying to achieve here? What feels important to address first and foremost? So, we want to take some time to connect to what that is for us. What is the message that we're trying to express? Do we know that? Right? Are we in autopilot and there actually isn't a moment of processing, a moment of pause where we take stock of what are we trying to say here? Are we aware of how we're saying it? So get to know what feels important for you to address. It's also important that we try to be direct as possible, to ask for what we want. So many of us have been taught to not directly ask for our needs, or we've had experiences in the past where we've had that belief reflected back to us that our needs are important, they shouldn't be voiced, but we all have a right to have our needs met, to be able to identify them, to also articulate them. Right? So do our best to be direct and to the point. That's going to actually save time for you and also the other individual or the parties that you're communicating with. So we also want to be able to negotiate. So this is about understanding what our needs are, and then also what are the needs of the other person or other parties that we're in conversation with, right? So effective interpersonal communication involves both parties being heard and understand and an understanding of what is happening for both parties. So we're going to do our best to try to aim to meet in the middle when possible. This is something that is actually sustaining in relationships, right? Reciprocity. It's about mutual respect. I have needs, and I have the ability to also be aware that the other person or parties have needs as well, and both are important. We also want to be able to gather information, so understand what is being communicated. What are you wanting to communicate? Take the time to understand what is happening in the here and now. What is influencing this dynamic? Right? Always in the here and now, right? We have that awareness that we each are coming in with our histories in a way that we interact with ourselves, in a way that we interact with people. All of this is colliding and coming together, right? Rubbing up against each other. Sometimes that's going to be something that's in flow and is easy, and sometimes it's going to create sparks. It is the reality of us being different, and it is all good. It's also important that we allow our no's to be no's and yeses to be yeses. So it's important we set healthy boundaries around what you're expressing. No is a complete sentence, as is yes. And there's no need to over explain. It's about understanding and also committing to what those are for you and letting it be known. The reality is, when it comes to things like boundaries and them being crossed, people aren't going to know what they are, what your boundaries are, and what is a violation, what is a crossing for you until you express it. And I know that can create um, a bit of internal discomfort for some folks, but that is the way. People will not know unless we let them know. It's also important that we align our behavior with our values. So sometimes when we are living outside of what we value, this can create tension, internal tension, resentment. So if we're feeling out of our control, so get to know what your values are, how you can act in alignment with what feels good, connected, healthy for you. And again, share that, right? That can be, hey, that didn't feel really good for me. This didn't land in a way that I liked, or I felt disrespected. I want to let you know this is what I value. This is important for me. It's also about active listening skills. This is one of the most important aspects, and this is a skill. So active listening is not waiting until the other person's finished speaking to then insert your response. It's about taking the time to ensure information is being correctly shared and heard. This can look like reflecting back what you heard to ensure clarity and no gaps, right? When there's gaps, we might tend or we might opt for filling the void with what we think or what we feel, right? And again, that's not a conversation. That's a monologue as opposed to a dialogue, right? So really create that space and that pause. It can also look like summarizing. So this would look like what I heard you say was, is this correct? So we're getting a moment to actually reflect what that person just said. And then they also get an opportunity to say, yeah, that's actually what I was saying, and that's what I'm trying to communicate. And so it's really about making sense together. We have different understandings of language. Even if we speak the same language, different words are going to have different meanings for us. So it's important that we create that space and we create that dialogue so this can be understood. I don't have to guess. I know what you think because you just what you expressed, and I got to reflect that back to you. So our communication is paramount to creating and sustaining healthy boundaries, right? So what style do you tend to use? Will look very different for all of us, right? It might be about the relationship we're in, the power we might feel like we have, or if we're feeling disempowered, we might opt for a different type of communication style. So again, just taking that time to understand how do I communicate, and why do I communicate in this way? So if we're communicating in a style that is passive, this communication style opts for the suppression of our needs in order to make space for someone else's needs. And what typically can happen here is that resentment can build, right? The needs of the other is always being highlighted while I'm pushing down my needs. So again, pay attention to that sort of relationship and that communication style and asking yourself why without the judgment, just noticing. We can also engage in aggressive communication, and this communication style opts for highlighting your needs without taking in the other person's needs. So, sort of like bulldozing over, this is what I want, this is what I need, and that takes precedent over anything else, right? So, it's not really relational at all. Um, and then there's also assertive. So, like, assertive communication is the sweet spot. So, this opts for highlighting our needs while also taking in the need of the other individual or parties within this relationship. So there's space for the needs, for the space for our needs, and then also the needs of the other people to be heard and validated. So it's important that we're clear and we're concise, and we don't need to over-explain our boundary. And it's also important that we pay attention to the nonverbal. So what is our body communicating? Sometimes our bodies, there might be a discrepancy between what we're verbally communicating and then what our body is actually saying. So it's really important. We're also paying attention to how's my body communicating right now. What is the impact of that? So we stand tall when we speak up with the body posture as well. How's your communication? So This is a good little tool that we can use rather, that we can check in with ourselves. So just looking at the communication style that we opt for. So this could be aggressive, assertive, passive, passive aggressive. Also taking a look at who do we use this type of style with. So how you communicate and with whom you use that style with can vary. Bring some attention to how you experience yourself in various relationships in your life. What style do you use at home versus at work, with friends versus a romantic partner, etc. Right? These will have various levels to them of intimacy and depth. So naturally, we may have very different communication styles. And so bring this into your awareness. There's also the level of effectiveness and how it affects me. So taking stock of, okay, I engage in this style with this individual, but how does it work for me, right? And so what we want to look at is take stock of how effective this style of communicating is when trying to get your needs met. An example, I feel like I'm not tending to my needs, and I feel like I put myself last. And having an understanding of how it makes you feel. It makes you feel bitter over time, and I tend to feel more distant and angrier with the ones around me. I don't think this way of communication is the most effective one for me and the people I care about. So that's just an example of what that can look like for you. And again, we just want to take stock of what is the style I'm using, who am I using it with, and is this actually an effective way to get my needs met or to communicate what's going on for me. So how can we improve our interpersonal communication? We want to define, so in order to understand what must be expressed about our needs, wants, desires, we must first identify what they are. So get to know, take that time. What am I looking for? What are my needs? What do I want out of my life? What do I desire? Once we've landed on these things, we then want to move towards our communication. So once we understand what our needs, wants, desires are, we want to express this to the appropriate persons or parties involved. We want to keep it simple, be clear and concise, no need to over-explain your boundary or what you're trying to communicate. And if there is a lack of understanding, which you can offer this up, do you understand what I'm communicating? It's an invitation, right? Oh no, I didn't catch what you said there, or is this what you meant? And if it isn't, right, we get to clear it up. And also we want to identify the why. So we want to let ourselves and others know why this is important and the consequences of violating or crossing. Um, some healthy assertive boundaries that we can set. In our physical boundary would be, I prefer to not be touched like that. I'm not a hugger. I'm more of a handshake person. In our emotional, right now is not a good time to have this conversation. Can we return to it at another point within our time? I'm free to chat during the week. On the weekends, I'm not available. Sexual, my role in relationship to you is as a support. Does that make sense? Intellectual, we can disagree without being hurtful. And material, no, I cannot give you that. Give you a ride, give you this material item. And so a violation of these can look like in the physical, not acknowledging the boundary, and often for your own physical needs. In our emotional, dismissing the emotional state of the other and moving forward anyways. With our time, requesting that the individual be available outside the allocated time mentioned. Sexual, so making unwanted and inappropriate sexual advances. In our intellectual, so making fun or belittling comments on ideas and thoughts. And also within our material, attempting to get material possessions from a relationship. So get to know, these are just some examples of what this can look like. Ultimately, it has to come from you and it has to feel organic in terms of what feels right for you. How do I want to assert this boundary? So conflict resolution and effective interpersonal communication. So effective interpersonal communication is the foundation needed to move towards conflict resolution. When communication is poor, disrespectful, or even irrelevant to what is being shared and communicated, potential for conflict can arise. So something that's really important is to attempt to repair as soon as possible. So rupture, so that's disagreement, disconnection, being out of sync, and repair, so reestablishing that connection is a part of any relationship. The earlier we can attend to these concerns, the better. And so to paint a picture of what this is like we're in a boat with somebody, and the boat represents the relationship, the container of our relationship. As we're treading over waters that can be unpredictable, some moments it can be calm, some moments it can be a little bit more rough. But if we're not actually attending to the holes that might happen in the boat, more and more water is going to collect over time, right? That might be more resentment, feeling further disconnected, right? It really it creates a larger gap to be filled. And so, what is important here in terms of repairing is the quicker that we can repair over and over, it starts to become a reflex, becomes more of a reflex, right? And so that also creates a culture in which it says, I see something, I'm going to address it, and we're going to repair. We're not going to wait a long time and have big holes and big gaps in connection, because it really impacts the work. It impacts the individual process, also the collective process. It's also important that we slow down. So you take a moment to pause, breathe, right? Your breath can be your pause, which is a great tool. Slow down. So that you can feel yourself, if you feel yourself stepping outside your window of tolerance and notice yourself getting angry or reactive to a person or situation, pause and understand what is happening in this very moment. What can I do in this very moment? Breathe. Acknowledge what you're experiencing, what's happening internally, what's happening outside of me. It's also important that we trust our gut, it's our intuition. If you feel like things are off or disconnected, this is an invitation for you to ask and find out. People won't know how you feel without you communicating this, and vice versa. You won't know how others feel. So build that bridge in which this behavior becomes reflexive. It says again, I'm going to normalize this behavior of, if I notice something or if I feel it, I'm going to actually speak on it. Right? So it's great for our emotional health. We can also be models of calm. So if you can sense the other party may be raising their intensity, this is an opportunity to breathe and model calm for the other person. So if we mirror when intensity is high, the intensity of the conflict is actually going to rise immediately. So be aware of that, right? So if somebody is shouting and yelling and you engage in the same shouting and yelling, it's actually going to just rev up the experience. As opposed to somebody, you can see their intensity rising, I'm actually going to model calm for you, right? So it provides a moment of objectivity. So a moment to look outside yourself, outside of your experience, and see, okay, this person's not reflecting the same thing back to me. Maybe I'm stepping outside and I got to regulate myself, right? We also want to take a pause, like I was saying. If you sense that you or the other party are not in the right space to hold this dialogue in that moment, so this is that emotional boundary. Hey, can we return to this at another point? I'm interested in having this conversation. We want to take a pause. You say, hey, I noticed myself getting a bit too amped up. Can we press pause and come back to this discussion later? It is very important for me and for us, whoever the us is in that dynamic. We also want to watch our body language and our tone. Both of these things matter. So we want to do our best to have this self-awareness, and if not, be open to the feedback on how you're being perceived while interacting with others. So open body language and an even-keeled pace and tone will support connection even during moments of conflict, right? You also want to use I versus you statements. When you use I statements, you invite empathy, mentalization, so acknowledgement that others also have thoughts, desires, needs outside of my own, and reflection. When we use you statements, you invite defensiveness and space for dispute of what you see in them. So with I statements, we can also take accountability and ownership over what we are experiencing. And what we are experiencing is real. What we feel is real and is valid, always. Even if that's not a truth of somebody else. So as we wrap up here, I just want to provide you with a moment of reflection and ask yourself, how aware am I of my blind spots? How do I impact others I connect with? Do I become defensive or rigid when called in or given feedback? And I invite you to ask these questions of yourself with curiosity. Thank you for joining us today, joining me rather. I look forward to sharing more and connecting with you again. Have a great day. Take care.